November 8, 2013. The most powerful typhoon ever recorded to make landfall was about to slam into the Philippines. Wind speeds reached 315 kilometers per hour. That's faster than a Formula One race car at top speed. The storm had a name, Haiyan, but Filipinos called it Yolanda. And what happened next would shock the world's most experienced disaster response teams. Picture this. Inside the Joint Typhoon Warning Center, meteorologists stared at their screens in disbelief. The storm was so massive, so violent, that their computer models kept spitting out error messages. One American meteorologist would later say it was like watching a category of storm that shouldn't exist. The spiral of clouds on the satellite image covered an area larger than the entire country it was about to hit. At Clark Air Base, home to international rescue operations in the Philippines, pilots from Australia, Japan, and the United States gathered around weather monitors. These weren't rookies. These were men and women who'd flown rescue missions in hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons across the Pacific. They'd seen the worst nature could throw at them. But as they watched Haiyan's approach, one by one they shook their heads. An Australian C-130 pilot radioed his command, "This is beyond our safety parameters. We cannot fly." A Japanese helicopter squadron leader made the same call, then the Americans. Every foreign rescue aircraft in the country was ordered to remain grounded until the storm passed. Here's what makes this moment so crucial. When a Category 5 storm hits, the first 24 hours are everything. After that, the death toll starts climbing exponentially. People trapped in collapsed buildings drown as water rises. The injured bleed out waiting for help. The sick die from lack of medicine. Every hour matters. Every minute counts. But international protocol is clear. You don't send crews into a Category 5 storm. The risk of losing the aircraft and everyone on board is too high. It's not cowardice, it's mathematics. If you crash trying to save 50 people, you've just added more deaths to the disaster. You wait for the storm to weaken. You wait for conditions to improve. You wait. Except waiting means people die. 50 kilometers away at Villamor Air Base in Manila, a different conversation was happening. Colonel Antonio Parlade stood in front of a room full of Philippine Air Force pilots. The base had taken a beating from the outer bands of the storm. Roof panels were missing. Water poured through broken windows. Outside, palm trees bent almost horizontal in the wind. The colonel's voice was calm, but his message was not. "We have reports of entire towns cut off. No power, no communication, rising water. The international teams are grounded. It's just us." Captain Reuben Basiao raised his hand. He was 38 years old, a father of 3, and had logged over 2,000 flight hours. "Sir, what are the wind conditions?" The colonel didn't sugarcoat it. 280 kilometers per hour sustained, gusts to 320, visibility near zero, and we have a 3-hour window before the eye wall shifts and closes off the affected areas completely. In any reasonable assessment, this was a suicide mission. The numbers said don't go. The weather models said don't go. Decades of international aviation safety protocols said don't go. But Basiao looked at his fellow pilots, Captain Jerry Besavia and Lieutenant Chito Mangilit, and asked a different question. Can our bird handle it? The bird was a Fokker F-27, a twin-engine turboprop that had been flying since the 1980s. It wasn't new, it wasn't fancy, it didn't have the sophisticated weather radar systems of the American C-130s or the Japanese Chinooks. It was just a reliable workhorse that the Philippine Air Force had been using for decades. The flight engineer, a veteran named Sergeant Ernesto Cruz, had maintained this particular aircraft for 15 years. He knew every rivet, every wire, every hydraulic line. When asked if the plane could handle Category 5 conditions, he gave an answer that would become legendary in Philippine aviation history.
The plane can handle it. Question is, can the pilots? Basiao smiled. Let's find out. At 11:47 a.m., as international rescue coordinators watched their grounded aircraft and waited for the storm to pass, the Philippine Air Force Fokker F-27 fired up its engines. The roar was almost swallowed by the screaming wind. Ground crew had to lie flat on the tarmac to avoid being blown away as they removed the wheel chocks. The control tower operator, his voice shaking, radioed, "Rescue 01, conditions are beyond safe limits for takeoff. You are not cleared for departure." There was a pause. Then Basiao's voice came back, steady as stone. "Tower, we're not asking for permission. We're informing you we're taking off. Those are our people out there." The tower operator later said he cried as he watched that plane roll down the runway. Takeoff in a Category 5 typhoon is not like regular flying. The crosswinds don't just push you sideways, they try to flip you over. As the Fokker F-27 accelerated, it bounced violently. The right wing dipped so low it nearly touched the tarmac. Basiao fought the controls, his co-pilot, Basiao, matching his inputs, both men using every ounce of strength to keep the nose straight. At 180 kilometers per hour, the plane lifted off, then immediately dropped back down. It bounced again. Then finally, it clawed into the air at an angle so steep it looked like it might stall and fall backwards. But it didn't stall. It climbed. Inside the cockpit, the instrument panel was a Christmas tree of warning lights. The turbulence was so severe that loose items flew around the cabin. Lieutenant Mangilit, monitoring the navigation systems, had to grip his seat with both hands to avoid being thrown against the ceiling. The plane would drop 50 feet in an instant, then get slammed upward by an updraft, then drop again. Basiao's voice came over the intercom, and here's what's remarkable. He sounded almost bored. "Little rough up here. Everyone stay strapped in?" The target was Tacloban City, the capital of Leyte province and one of the hardest hit areas. Before the typhoon, Tacloban had a population of 220,000. After Haiyan passed through, nobody knew how many were alive. The last communication from the city had come 12 hours earlier. "Storm surge approaching, water rising rapidly. This may be our final transmission." Then silence. A storm surge, for those who don't know, is essentially a tsunami caused by a hurricane. The typhoon's winds push ocean water ahead of it, creating a wall of water that can be 7 meters or more. When that wall hits land, it destroys everything in its path. Survivors would later describe it as the sea coming to swallow the city. Cars were found in trees. Ships were pushed 3 kilometers inland. Entire neighborhoods simply vanished. As the F-27 approached Tacloban, the crew couldn't see the city. They couldn't see anything. The rain was so thick it was like flying through a waterfall. Basiao kept his eyes on the instruments because looking out the windscreen was useless. The radar showed the airport below them, but radar can't tell you if the runway is clear or covered in debris. It can't tell you if the runway even exists. It can't tell you if there are people on the runway trying to signal for help. Basiao made a decision that would later be studied in aviation schools as either brilliant or insane, depending on who you asked. He descended below the cloud cover. This meant flying at 150 meters altitude in Category 5 winds. At that height, sudden downdrafts can slam you into the ground before you can react. Updrafts can flip you upside down. Wind shear can tear the wings off. But it was the only way to see where they were landing. When they broke through the clouds, what they saw made them go silent. Tacloban was gone. Not damaged, gone. Where there had been streets and houses and schools, there was just brown water filled with debris. Bodies floated among the wreckage. The airport tower had collapsed, but the runway, miraculously, was mostly clear. Mostly. Basiao lined up for landing. The crosswind was pushing them sideways at 90 kilometers per hour. He had to aim the plane at a 45-degree angle to the runway just to track straight. The wheels touched down hard, bounced, touched down again. The plane skidded sideways. Basiao and Basiao both stood on the brakes. The old F-27 shuddered and groaned but held together. They stopped with less than 200 meters of runway to spare. They had landed in hell. As the rear door opened, the full horror of the situation became clear. Thousands of people were at the airport, not hundreds, thousands. They had walked, crawled, and swum there because airports mean rescue. They were injured, starving, desperate. Many were children, some were dying. A mother held up her baby, screaming for help. The baby wasn't moving. An old man clutched his chest, clearly having a heart attack. A teenage girl had a piece of metal in her leg and was going into shock. The Fokker F-27 could carry 40 people maximum. There were 5,000 people at that airport. How do you choose? How do you decide who lives and who waits, knowing that waiting might mean death?
Basiao made another call that would haunt him for years, but that everyone later agreed was correct. Critical cases first. Children, pregnant women, severe injuries. Load them now. The loadmaster, Sergeant Paulo Reyes, organized the chaos. He was shouting, pulling people forward, pushing others back, all while the plane rocked in the wind. They loaded 42 people in 8 minutes. They were overweight capacity, but Basiao didn't care. As they prepared to close the door, a man pushed through the crowd. He was carrying 2 small children, neither of them his. He'd found them trapped in a collapsed house. "Please," he begged, "just take them, leave me." Reyes looked at Basiao. Basiao looked at the fuel gauge. They were already pushing it. Every extra kilogram meant more fuel burned, and they needed fuel to fight the headwinds going back. But Basiao nodded. The 2 children were pulled aboard. The man who saved them stepped back into the crowd and disappeared. Nobody ever learned his name. Takeoff was worse than landing. The plane was overloaded. The runway was short. The headwind was now a tailwind, which meant they'd accelerate slower and need more distance. Basiao pushed the throttles to maximum. The engine screamed. The plane rolled and rolled and rolled. They were running out of runway. At the last possible second, Basiao pulled back. The F-27 lifted off with meters to spare, immediately got hit by a crosswind, tilted 45 degrees, then leveled out. They were flying again. In the back, 44 people who had thought they were going to die slowly realized they might live. Some cried, some prayed, some just stared in shock. A nurse who had been working non-stop for 20 hours before being evacuated would later say, "When those Filipino pilots landed in that storm, when everyone else said it was impossible, I knew we still had hope. I knew someone was fighting for us." The return flight took 90 minutes. Every minute was a battle. The autopilot had given up, couldn't handle the turbulence, so Basiao and Basiao had to hand-fly the entire route. Their arms ached, their hands cramped, but they didn't let go. When they finally touched down at Villamor Air Base, ground crews ran to the aircraft. They'd been listening to the radio, hearing the reports, not knowing if the plane would make it back. When they saw it land safely, several of them openly wept. But here's the thing, they weren't done. As soon as the evacuees were offloaded and rushed to medical care, as soon as the plane was refueled, Basiao and his crew got right back in. "We can fit 40 more per trip," he told the colonel. "That's 360 people if we fly 9 more times today. Let's get moving." They flew into that Category 5 storm 9 times that day. 9 times they landed in Tacloban. 9 times they loaded desperate people. 9 times they fought their way back through winds that were trying to kill them. By the time darkness forced them to stop, they had evacuated 378 people, and they were just one crew. Other Philippine Air Force pilots were doing the same thing. Captain Rico Valdez flew a UH-1 helicopter through the storm and pulled 23 people off rooftops before a wind gust nearly threw him into a building. Lieutenant Maya Santos flew medical supplies into cut-off towns using visual navigation because her instruments had failed. Master Sergeant Eddie Palacio made 7 trips in a vintage Huey that was older than he was. Meanwhile, the international rescue teams remained grounded, not because they were cowards, not because they didn't care, but because their protocols, designed to keep people safe, prevented them from doing what the Filipinos were doing.
When Australian commanders saw the flight reports coming from the Philippine Air Force, they were stunned. One Australian pilot said, "What they did wasn't flying. It was controlled crashing in slow motion. It should have been impossible." But it wasn't impossible. It was necessary, and that's the difference. Over the next 72 hours, as the storm finally weakened and international aircraft could begin flying, the full scope of what the Filipino pilots had accomplished became clear. In those first critical hours, when everyone else was grounded, they had evacuated over 2,400 people. They had delivered 15 tons of medical supplies. They had established the first communication links with cut-off areas. They had proved that sometimes, when everything says stop, you have to go anyway. The final death toll from Typhoon Haiyan was over 6,300 people, with more than 1,000 still missing. It was one of the deadliest typhoons in Philippine history, but every single person evacuated by those Filipino pilots in that first day survived. Every one. When asked later how many lives they'd saved, Captain Basiao said something that sums up the entire story. "We didn't count, we just flew." The international community eventually awarded the Philippine Air Force pilots involved in the Haiyan rescue operations. They received medals, commendations, and recognition from governments around the world. But if you ask those pilots what mattered most, they'll tell you it wasn't the medals, it was the letters. Hundreds of letters from survivors and their families. Letters that said thank you for not giving up on us. Letters that said you flew when no one else would. Letters that said you saved my child. One letter came from the man who had given up his seat on that first flight so 2 orphaned children could escape. He survived the storm. He wrote, "I stayed behind because I believed you would come back. I believed Filipino pilots don't abandon Filipinos. I was right." Today, if you visit Villamor Air Base, there's a memorial. It's not fancy, just a simple plaque with the names of the crews who flew into Haiyan and a single line. When the storm was Category 5 and the world stayed grounded, they took off. Veteran pilots bring young trainees there and tell them the story. They explain the weather conditions, they describe the impossible odds, and then they say, "This is what it means to be a Filipino pilot. When your people need you, there is no such thing as too dangerous. There is only the mission." The old Fokker F-27 that made that first flight is still flying, still conducting rescue operations. The Philippine Air Force could retire it, but they won't. They maintain it carefully, lovingly even, because that plane represents something important. It represents the idea that you don't need the newest equipment or the biggest budget to do extraordinary things. You just need courage, skill, and the absolute refusal to abandon people who need help. Category 5 storms will come again. They always do. And when they come, there will be protocols and safety guidelines and international coordination. There will be risk assessments and weather models and carefully calculated decisions. All of that is important. All of that saves lives. But there will also be moments when the math says stay grounded and the heart says fly. And in those moments, somewhere in the Philippines, pilots will be starting their engines, because some things are more important than safety protocols. Some things matter more than following the rules. Sometimes you have to look at the impossible and decide to do it anyway. That's not recklessness. That's not stupidity. That's knowing exactly how far you can push the limits when lives hang in the balance. That's what happened when the storm was Category 5, when foreign rescue was grounded and Filipino pilots took off into the fury and came back with their people every single time.